I tracked the pattern of missing person posters. Now my phone won't stop ringing. I first noticed the pattern during my morning jog 3 months ago. There was a missing person poster stapled to a telephone pole on Riverside Drive, right where I always stopped to stretch. The face staring back at me belonged to a young woman named Caitlin Wu, 24 years old, last seen leaving her apartment on August 3rd. The poster had that desperate quality they all have, the pixelated photo, the bold letters begging for information, the heartbroken family's phone number at the bottom. What caught my attention wasn't the poster itself. I'd seen dozens of those over the years living in the city. What made me pause was realizing I'd seen an identical poster format 3 blocks away last week for someone completely different. Same paper stock, same font, same layout, just different faces and names. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of Caitlin's poster, then continued my run. By the time I got home, I'd photographed 4 more missing person posters along my usual route. All of them had that same distinctive format with a red border and specific typography. All of them listed disappearances within the past 6 months. All of them were stapled to poles or taped to bus shelters in a 6-block radius of my neighborhood. My roommate Destiny was making coffee when I got back, and I showed her the photos on my phone. She barely glanced at them before shrugging and saying, "The city has lots of missing people, unfortunately, and maybe someone made a template that families use." It made sense when she said it like that. A practical explanation for what I'd noticed. But I couldn't let it go. I spent my lunch break that day walking a different route through downtown, and sure enough, I found 8 more posters with that exact same format. Different faces, different names, different dates, but always that distinctive red border and identical layout. I started a spreadsheet that afternoon, logging each poster with the person's name, age, last seen date, and the exact GPS coordinates where I found it. My coworker Vincent caught me photographing a poster outside our office building the next morning. He asked what I was doing, and I explained about the pattern I'd noticed. He said his cousin worked for a nonprofit that helped families of missing persons, and they probably distributed template materials, that people use standard formats because they work and stand out. Another rational explanation that should have satisfied me. But that weekend, I spent 7 hours walking a grid pattern through the entire downtown area, photographing every missing person poster I could find. I covered maybe 40 square blocks, taking pictures of street signs to mark locations, zooming in on every detail of each poster. By Sunday evening, I had 73 photographs of missing person posters, and my feet hurt so bad I could barely walk. Back home, I spread all the photos across my living room floor and started sorting them. The posters fell into 3 distinct categories based on format. The red-bordered ones I'd initially noticed, a blue-bordered set with different typography, and miscellaneous ones that were clearly homemade by individual families. The red-bordered set had 31 posters. The blue-bordered set had 24. The rest were singles. I spent the next 2 days building a detailed database. Name, age, gender, race, last seen date, last seen location, poster format type. I mapped everything in a spreadsheet with color coding and formulas. Destiny came home from work and found me surrounded by printed maps with colored pins stuck in them, looking like some conspiracy theorist from a movie. She sat down on the floor next to me and asked if I was okay because this seemed kind of obsessive. I showed her the data and explained that all 31 red-bordered posters showed people who went missing within a specific geographic area. Not just posted in that area, but actually disappeared from locations within a 2-mile radius of downtown. The blue-bordered ones showed a similar pattern in a different neighborhood across town. Destiny studied my maps for a long time before admitting that did seem weird. She asked what I planned to do with this information. I told her I didn't know yet, but something felt wrong about it. She made me promise not to do anything dangerous or stupid, and I agreed, even though I wasn't sure what that meant yet. The next morning, I called the police non-emergency line and explained what I'd found. The operator listened patiently while I described the pattern of posters and the geographic clustering. She took my name and number and said someone would follow up if they needed more information. I never heard back from them. I tried the FBI's TIPS website next, filling out their online form with all my data and photos. The confirmation email said they received my submission and would review it accordingly. Again, nothing. No follow-up, no questions, no interest. Frustrated, I started calling the phone numbers listed on the actual posters. The first one I tried was for Caitlin Wu, the woman whose poster had started this whole thing. A woman answered on the 3rd ring, her voice heavy with exhaustion. I introduced myself and explained I'd seen her daughter's poster and wanted to help. She started crying immediately, thanking me for calling, saying most people just walk past like Caitlin never existed. I asked her who made the poster with the red border, and there was a long pause before she said a volunteer organization called Metro Missing Persons Network had offered to help with printing and distribution. They'd provided the template for free and posted it all over the city. I called 6 more numbers from red-bordered posters, and every single family told me the same story. Metro Missing Persons Network had reached out to them, offered free poster design and distribution, handled everything professionally. Families were grateful because making posters and putting them up yourself is expensive and exhausting when you're already dealing with trauma. I searched for Metro Missing Persons Network online and found a basic website with stock photos and vague mission statements about helping families. No staff directory, no physical address, no real information about who ran it or how they operated. The contact page had only an email address and a phone number. I called the number and got a voicemail with a generic greeting asking me to leave a message. I didn't. Instead, I sent an email claiming I was a journalism student doing a research project on missing persons advocacy and wanted to interview someone from their organization. I never got a response. The blue-bordered posters led to a similar organization called Community Search Alliance. Different name, same vague website, same lack of transparency. I called 12 families whose posters had that blue border, and all of them had nearly identical stories. The organization reached out, offered help, provided professional materials, handled distribution. I spent the next week digging deeper into both organizations. Their websites had been registered within 6 months of each other 2 years ago, both using privacy protection services that hid the actual registrants. Their social media accounts posted generic inspirational content, but never showed actual staff or volunteers. No local news coverage mentioned either organization, despite them supposedly helping dozens of families. My girlfriend Sienna came over for dinner that Friday and found me hunched over my laptop, still researching. She asked if I was still obsessing over the missing person poster thing, and I bristled at the word obsessing. I was investigating, not obsessing. There was a difference. She said it didn't look much different from the outside and suggested maybe I should take a break. We fought about it. She said I was neglecting our relationship and spending all my free time on this project that might not even be anything suspicious. I said something really mattered more than just watching movies and pretending everything was fine. She left angry, and I immediately felt guilty, but also couldn't stop myself from going right back to the laptop. I started cross-referencing the missing persons from both sets of posters with police databases and news reports. Out of the 55 people represented in the red and blue bordered posters, only 31 had any media coverage at all. The rest had seemingly vanished without even a local news mention. That felt wrong because missing persons usually generate at least some news coverage, especially in the first few weeks. I found a private investigator named Dorothy Huang through an online directory and called her office. I explained the whole situation, and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said it sounded interesting but potentially just a legitimate nonprofit that wasn't great at public relations. I asked if she'd look into it anyway, and she quoted me a rate I definitely couldn't afford. Instead, I posted about it on a true crime forum I sometimes read. I laid out all the data, included my maps and photos, explained the patterns I'd found. The responses were mixed. Some people thought it was genuinely suspicious and worth investigating. Others said I was seeing patterns where none existed and making connections that weren't there. One person accused me of being disrespectful to grieving families by treating their tragedy like a puzzle. That last comment stuck with me. I hadn't thought about it that way. These weren't just data points in my spreadsheet. They were real people who'd disappeared, real families suffering. Was I helping or just feeding my own curiosity? I closed my laptop and didn't touch the project for 3 days. But then I got a phone call on a Wednesday evening from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The man on the other end introduced himself as Keith Novak and said he was Caitlin Wu's uncle. He'd heard I'd been asking questions and wanted to talk to me. We met at a coffee shop downtown the next morning. Keith was in his 50s, wearing a wrinkled button-down and looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. He thanked me for reaching out to his sister and taking interest in Caitlin's case. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. His sister had gotten another call about a week after mine. Someone claiming to work for Metro Missing Persons Network, saying they'd heard I was asking questions about their organization and they wanted to make sure the family knew I wasn't actually affiliated with law enforcement or any official investigation. The caller had been polite but firm in making that clear. I asked if they'd said anything else, and Keith nodded slowly. The caller had suggested that sometimes amateur investigators did more harm than good, potentially interfering with ongoing cases or giving families false hope. They'd recommended his sister not engage with me further if I contacted her again. My hands started shaking as I held my coffee cup. Someone from Metro Missing Persons Network was monitoring the families they'd helped, tracking who contacted them, calling to control the narrative. That wasn't normal nonprofit behavior. That was something else entirely. Keith said he'd done his own digging after that call because it seemed off. He'd found 3 other families who'd gotten similar calls after various people had started asking questions about the posters. Nothing threatening exactly, just friendly warnings about amateur investigators causing problems. I showed Keith all my data, and we spent 2 hours going through everything together. He pointed out something I'd missed. The missing persons from the red-bordered posters all had something in common beyond geography. They were all adults between 19 and 35, all disappeared during evening or nighttime. Hours. All were last seen alone. We spread out the blue-bordered posters next, and the pattern there was slightly different. Slightly older demographic, 25 to 40, but still evening disappearances, still alone when last seen. Keith said whatever this was, it seemed targeted. Specific types of people in specific circumstances. I went home that afternoon and created a new spreadsheet with additional columns for time of day last seen, whether they were alone, what they were doing when they disappeared. The patterns became even clearer. The red-bordered posters represented people who'd vanished while walking home from evening activities. The blue-bordered set showed people who'd disappeared from parking lots or garages at night. My phone rang that evening, and the caller ID showed unknown number. I answered and heard a woman's voice, professional and calm, asking if this was me. When I confirmed, she said her name was Veronica, and she was calling from Metro Missing Persons Network. My heart started racing. She said they'd heard I'd been researching their organization and wanted to offer a conversation to answer any questions I might have. Her tone was friendly, almost chatty, but something underneath it felt calculated. I asked how they'd gotten my number, and she said Keith's sister had mentioned my outreach, and they'd looked me up to offer assistance. I didn't believe that for a second. I asked what Metro Missing Persons Network actually did besides make posters. Veronica explained they were a volunteer organization dedicated to keeping missing persons cases visible to the public. They'd found that many families couldn't afford professional poster design or wide distribution, so they provided those services at no cost. It sounded reasonable, but I pushed further. I asked why their website had so little information, why there was no staff listing, why they didn't appear in any news coverage despite helping so many families. Veronica paused for a long moment before saying they preferred to keep their focus on the families rather than seeking publicity for themselves. I asked how they decided which cases to help. Another pause. Then she said families reached out to them through their website, and they did their best to assist everyone who asked. I pointed out that all the families I'd spoken with said Metro Missing Persons Network had contacted them first, not the other way around. The line went quiet for several seconds. Then Veronica's tone shifted, becoming slightly less friendly. She said I seemed to have some misconceptions about their operations, and if I was going to continue asking questions about them publicly, they'd need me to be accurate in what I shared. It felt like a warning. I asked what would happen if I wasn't accurate. She said misinformation could be harmful to their mission and to grieving families, and they'd need to take appropriate steps to correct it. Then she thanked me for my time and ended the call before I could respond. I immediately called Keith and told him about the conversation. He said it confirmed what he'd suspected. This wasn't a normal nonprofit. Normal nonprofits don't track down people asking questions and call them with veiled threats. He said he was going to reach out to other families and see if anyone else had gotten strange calls. That night, I created a new email account not connected to my real name and sent detailed messages to 3 investigative journalists at different publications. I included all my data, the maps, the photos, the patterns, everything about both organizations. I explained that someone was monitoring families of missing persons and controlling information flow around these cases. 2 of the journalists never responded. The third sent back a polite message saying it was interesting, but they'd need more concrete evidence of wrongdoing before pursuing it as a story. What I had was circumstantial, could easily be explained as a poorly run nonprofit being defensive. I was hitting walls everywhere. The police weren't interested. The FBI wasn't interested. Journalists weren't interested. But my phone started ringing constantly from unknown numbers. Sometimes I'd answer and hear nothing but silence before the line disconnected. Sometimes I'd get calls at 2 or 3 in the morning that would ring twice then stop. Destiny noticed I was barely sleeping and asked if the phone calls were still happening. I told her they'd gotten worse, and she suggested I change my number. I said that would make it harder for families or legitimate sources to reach me if they wanted to share information. She looked at me like I was losing perspective on what was reasonable. Sienna stopped returning my texts. When I finally got her on the phone, she said she needed space because I'd become completely consumed by this investigation and wasn't the person she'd started dating. I tried to explain that something real was happening, but she said even if it was, I'd let it take over my entire life. We ended things that night, and I told myself it was for the best, even though it hurt. My work performance started slipping. I'd be in meetings staring at my phone, wondering if the next call would be important. My manager pulled me aside and said I seemed distracted lately and asked if everything was okay at home. I lied and said I was fine, just dealing with some personal stuff that would resolve soon. Keith called me 2 weeks after our coffee shop meeting with news. He'd connected with 8 other families who'd worked with either Metro Missing Persons Network or Community Search Alliance. All of them had gotten similar calls if anyone started asking too many questions. All of them had felt like they were being monitored. More significantly, he'd found 2 families whose missing relatives had been found dead, and in both cases, Metro Missing Persons Network had contacted them within hours of the bodies being discovered, before the police had officially notified the families in one case. Keith said there was no way a volunteer organization should have access to that information that quickly. I added this to my documentation and tried the journalists again. This time, one of them responded with actual interest. Her name was Lauren, and she worked for an online publication that did deep investigative pieces. She wanted to meet in person to go through everything. We met at a restaurant across town, and I brought printed copies of all my data. Lauren spent an hour reviewing everything, taking notes, asking smart questions. She said this could potentially be a story, but she'd need to verify everything independently and find additional sources. She asked if I was willing to be named in the article, and I said yes. Lauren said she'd need a few weeks to do proper reporting, and she made me promise not to post anything publicly or talk to other media until she published. I agreed because I wanted this done right, wanted it to have impact, rather than just being another ignored internet post. 3 days later, I got a call from a blocked number while I was at work. I stepped outside to answer it, and a man's voice asked if this was me. When I confirmed, he said his name was Daniel Ortega, and he was a detective with the police department's missing persons unit. He said my name had come up in connection with some inquiries about local cases, and he wanted to understand what I'd been doing. I explained the whole thing from the beginning, trying to keep my voice steady. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying he'd like to meet and review my findings. We met at a police station the next morning. Detective Ortega was in his 40s with gray starting to show in his dark hair, wearing a tired expression that suggested he'd seen too much. I showed him everything, and he took photos of my maps and made copies of my data. He said the department had received complaints from Metro Missing Persons Network about someone harassing families and spreading misinformation about their organization. When I asked what kind of complaints, he said they'd filed formal reports claiming I was presenting myself as law enforcement and telling families their cases weren't being properly investigated. I protested that I'd never claimed to be law enforcement and had only asked questions about the poster distribution. Detective Ortega said he believed me, but the formal complaints created a paper trail that could become problematic if Metro Missing Persons Network decided to pursue legal action. He warned me that organizations like this often had lawyers and resources to make life difficult for people asking unwanted questions. He said I should be careful about what I shared publicly and with whom. Then he told me something that changed everything. The police had actually received multiple tips over the past year about both Metro Missing Persons Network and Community Search Alliance. Several families had reported feeling like they were being monitored or followed, but every time they'd tried to investigate, they'd hit dead ends. The organizations had no physical addresses, no actual staff they could identify, no traceable funding sources. Detective Ortega said the whole setup felt wrong to him personally, but without evidence of an actual crime, there wasn't much the department could do. They couldn't investigate an organization just for being creepy and secretive. He suggested I be very careful going forward, and if I found any concrete evidence of illegal activity, to bring it directly to him. I left that meeting feeling validated that my suspicions were correct, but frustrated that nothing could apparently be done about it. I called Lauren and told her about the detective's confirmation. She said that helped her case for pursuing the story, but she still needed more time to nail down additional details. My phone rang constantly over the next 3 weeks. Unknown numbers at all hours. Sometimes I'd answer to silence. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like ambient noise, people talking in the background, before the line went dead. Twice I heard what sounded like someone breathing before they hung up. I started documenting every call, keeping a log with times and any details I could note. Destiny said I should just block all unknown numbers, but I was worried I'd miss something important. The constant ringing was destroying my sleep. I'd wake up at 2 a.m. to my phone buzzing and lie awake afterward, unable to fall back asleep. Keith called me one night, clearly upset. His sister had gotten a visit at her home from someone claiming to represent Metro Missing Persons Network, a woman who said she wanted to discuss their continued poster distribution for Caitlin's case. But during the conversation, she'd casually mentioned that it was important families didn't let amateur investigators give them false hope or distract from the real search efforts. Keith's sister had felt threatened, even though nothing explicitly threatening was said. The woman had stayed for almost an hour, asking seemingly friendly questions about who else they'd talked to about Caitlin's case and what kind of information they'd shared. After she left, Keith's sister had called him crying, saying she felt like she was being watched. I asked if his sister had gotten the woman's name or contact information. Keith said she'd only given a first name, Nicole, and had avoided giving any business card or written materials. She'd claimed she was just checking in personally to make sure the family had everything they needed. This was escalating beyond mysterious phone calls. They were now making in-person contact with families, clearly trying to figure out who was talking to whom and what information was being shared. I called Detective Ortega and told him about Keith's sister's experience. He said to have her file a formal report, but warned that without evidence of threats or harassment, it would just be documentation. Lauren published her article 4 weeks after our initial meeting. It was extensive and well-researched, laying out the patterns I'd found, the organization's suspicious behavior, the monitoring of families, Detective Ortega's confirmation that police had concerns, but no evidence of crimes. She'd tracked down 12 families who'd worked with these organizations, and 6 who'd felt monitored or harassed after asking questions. The article went viral immediately. Within hours, it was being shared across social media, picked up by other news outlets, discussed on local radio shows. My phone exploded with calls and messages from people wanting to talk about it, asking questions, sharing their own experiences with similar organizations in other cities. That last part was what shocked me. People started reaching out from different states, saying they'd noticed identical patterns in their areas. Missing person posters with specific formats, mysterious volunteer organizations with no transparency, families feeling monitored. This wasn't just a local issue. It was happening in at least 6 other cities across the country. Lauren published a follow-up piece 3 days later focusing on the multi-state nature of whatever this operation was. She'd found similar organizations in Dallas, Phoenix, Atlanta, Portland, and Boston, all with the same characteristics. Vague websites, no physical locations, professional poster production, and families who felt watched after working with them. The FBI's involvement started after that second article. Special Agent Melissa Carver contacted me directly, asking to meet. She said the Bureau was opening an investigation into potential interstate criminal activity related to missing persons cases. They wanted all my data and documentation. I met with Agent Carver at a federal building downtown, bringing everything I had on a USB drive. She reviewed it all methodically, asking detailed questions about how I'd compiled the information and who I'd spoken with. She said they were treating this seriously now that it appeared to involve multiple states and a coordinated network. She warned me that if this was what it appeared to be, some kind of organized operation exploiting missing persons cases, the people behind it would not appreciate federal attention. She said I should be prepared for potential retaliation and should report any threats or suspicious activity immediately. The phone calls to me stopped completely after the FBI got involved. It was like someone had flipped a switch. My phone went from ringing constantly to being silent except for normal expected calls. The sudden absence of harassment was almost more unnerving than the constant ringing had been. Keith called to say his sister had also stopped getting any contact from Metro Missing Persons Network. Other families reported the same thing. Whatever these organizations were, they'd gone completely silent the moment federal investigators got involved. The websites for both Metro Missing Persons Network and Community Search Alliance disappeared overnight. The domains just stopped resolving, showing error pages. Their social media accounts were deleted. It was like they'd never existed except for all the posters still stapled to poles and taped to walls around the city. Agent Carver called me 6 weeks after our initial meeting. She said she couldn't share details about the ongoing investigation, but they'd identified several individuals of interest and were pursuing leads. She thanked me for bringing this to their attention and said my documentation had been crucial in establishing the scope of the operation. She also told me that they'd found evidence suggesting the organizations weren't just monitoring families. They appeared to be using the missing persons cases as cover for something larger, though she couldn't elaborate on what. She said I should feel proud of the work I'd done in exposing this, but I should also remain vigilant because the people behind it were still at large. The local police called me in for another meeting 3 months after Lauren's article published. Detective Ortega had 2 colleagues with him this time. They said the FBI had shared information that led them to reopen several missing persons cases with fresh eyes. They'd found connections they'd missed before, patterns that suggested some of the disappearances might be related. They couldn't give me specifics, but they said my initial observation about the geographic clustering had been correct. There were patterns in how and where people were disappearing that suggested targeting rather than random chance. They were now investigating these cases as potentially connected rather than isolated incidents. I asked if any of the missing people had been found. Detective Ortega's expression darkened, and he said they'd located 2 bodies that had previously been unidentified. Both had been found months before their families reported them missing, filed as Jane Does. The posters from Metro Missing Persons Network had been put up well after these people were already dead. That information sat in my stomach like lead. These organizations hadn't just been exploiting families' trauma. They'd been posting missing person posters for people they potentially knew were already dead, using the searches as cover for something else, just like Agent Carver had hinted. Lauren published a 3rd article 6 months after her initial investigation. The FBI had made arrests in connection with a human trafficking ring that had been using missing persons cases as cover for their operation. They'd identify vulnerable individuals, facilitate their disappearances, and then create highly visible missing person campaigns that made it look like active searches were happening while actually controlling the narrative about where investigators should look. The poster distribution had been part of the misdirection. By flooding specific neighborhoods with posters, they'd established a public record of concern while ensuring that search efforts stayed far away from where victims were actually taken. The organizations had been sophisticated operations run by people with law enforcement or private investigation backgrounds who knew exactly how to manipulate the system. 7 people were arrested in total, facing charges including kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, and interference with law enforcement investigations. The FBI estimated they'd been operating for at least 3 years before I'd noticed the poster patterns. Keith called me the day after the arrests, his voice shaking with emotion. Caitlin's case was one of those being reinvestigated with this new information. They hadn't found her yet, but at least now they had a real direction to search. He thanked me over and over, saying I'd given his family the first real hope they'd had in months. I got calls from 4 other families whose cases were being reinvestigated. They all expressed similar gratitude mixed with horror at learning that the people who'd supposedly been helping them search had actually been involved in the disappearances. The betrayal of that was almost as painful as the initial loss. The local news did a feature story about how my initial observations had led to the federal investigation. I did one interview, keeping it brief, emphasizing that I'd just noticed something strange and that the real credit belonged to Lauren for taking it seriously and the FBI for doing the actual investigation. I didn't want to be portrayed as some amateur detective hero when real people had suffered real harm. Sienna reached out after seeing the news coverage. She apologized for not taking my concerns seriously when we were together, said she'd judged me unfairly for being obsessed. I appreciated the apology but told her I understood her perspective at the time. From the outside, I'm sure I had looked like I was spiraling into conspiracy theories. We had coffee and caught up, but we didn't get back together. Too much had changed for both of us. My work life stabilized once the investigation went public, and I wasn't spending every spare moment documenting posters and making phone calls. My manager said he was impressed by my persistence in pursuing something I believed in, and my performance reviews returned to normal. Destiny moved out 6 months after everything concluded, not because of any problems between us, but because she'd gotten a job offer in another city. Before she left, she told me she was proud of me for not letting everyone convince me I was crazy. She said most people would have given up after the first few dismissive responses, but I'd kept pushing until someone listened. Detective Ortega called me a year after the arrests to tell me that 3 more victims had been found alive through the investigation. They'd been trafficked out of state, but were recovered through coordinated operations. 2 of them were from the missing persons posters I'd originally documented. He said I'd helped save lives by noticing those patterns. The case went to trial 18 months after the initial arrests. I had to testify about how I'd first noticed the poster patterns and what had made me suspicious of the organizations. The defense attorneys tried to make me look like an obsessive conspiracy theorist who jumped to conclusions, but the evidence was overwhelming. All 7 defendants were convicted on multiple charges. Lauren won a regional journalism award for her investigative series. She thanked me in her acceptance speech, calling me a concerned citizen who'd refused to look away from something that didn't make sense. The publication promoted her to senior investigative reporter. I still take morning jogs along Riverside Drive, but now when I see missing person posters, I look at them differently. I take the time to actually read each one, to see the person represented rather than just another piece of paper stapled to a pole. I call the numbers sometimes if I think I might have information, making sure that someone who actually cares is on the other end. The FBI created a task force dedicated to identifying similar operations in other cities. They've found evidence of at least 4 more groups using the same tactics, exploiting missing persons cases for criminal enterprises. Agent Carver said my initial pattern recognition helped them understand what to look for, and they've been able to intervene earlier in other locations. 3 years after I first noticed those posters, I got an email from Keith. They'd found Caitlin's remains through information obtained from one of the convicted traffickers. It wasn't the ending her family had hoped for, but at least they had answers. At least they could bring her home. Keith said, knowing the truth, as painful as it was, had given them a way to finally begin grieving properly. I think about all the times I was told I was overthinking it, seeing patterns that weren't there, wasting my time on something that was probably nothing. I think about how close I came to listening to those voices and just letting it go, and I'm grateful I didn't, even though it cost me sleep and a relationship and nearly my job. Because sometimes the patterns are real, and sometimes the thing that seems too strange to be true is exactly what it appears to be.